Chapter 6, Murray Burnham, Rabbit Hunting, First Deer Hunt, Family Relatives. We were first introduced to May and Murray Burnham by Mrs. Grills, my landlord lady, way back when I started at Ford. Murray had been her boarder before me, and she considered him to be a pretty fine fellow. The Burnhams and the DeWitts had been friends all these years. They moved from Toronto to Newmarket, and Murray sold Rayleigh products until his car burned with all of his goods that he was selling inside it. They then bought a 45-acre farm on the Fly Road, 4 miles south of Beamsville. We visited each other frequently, hunted together, and often worked together raising pigs. About 3 or 4 times a year during the winter months, the residents of Murray's area had jackrabbit drives to help cut down on the damage they were doing to agriculture. I was invited to join the group of 40 or 50 men, and we had some really good days. Dick, Ira, Lee, and Ellis Corman went with me a few times. The name of the game was to get rid of as many rabbits as possible. Half of the men were stationed at 50-yard intervals along the road, and the other half walked towards them, starting from the next road 1.25 miles away. There were often 6 or 8 rabbits running in every direction as the distance got smaller between the two groups. Sometimes a fox would be in the bunch, which always added to the excitement. They were the tricky ones. I have seen a fox run from end to end, exactly halfway between the two lines of men, just slightly out of shooting range for both, and out the end to freedom. Every man in both lines let drive on the off chance that he might get lucky, only to see the shot from his gun kick up puffs of snow 5 or 6 feet behind the fox. Foxes could be quite destructive in a farmland, and were therefore considered pests. The meat from the rabbits was seldom wasted. In fact, Mother would make a really tasty dish from the 5 or 6 pounds of non-fat meat on the average jackrabbit size. I was using a 16-gauge pump gun, and I think Douglas Book, Murray's 16-year-old nephew, had the only other 16-gauge gun in the group. It happened that Doug ran out of shells, so I gave him some 7-year-old shells that Del Pierre had loaded himself with black powder. I carried them to be used only in cases of desperation, because their power had long gone, and they were a little hard on the gun, slightly better than nothing. I told him about them, but he said he was happy to have anything that would go bang. After he left me and took his position in line, I told those nearest to me to watch the fun when Doug saw his next rabbit. We were approaching a wooded area when one got up in front of Murray, who shot and bowled him over but didn't stop him. The rabbit headed across in front of Doug. He took careful aim and fired, and the smoke and yellow fire that came from the muzzle was hard to believe. There was no wind at all, and that cloud of smoke hung in front of Doug like a piece of canvas entirely blocking his view. He dropped to one knee to peek under the smoke and fired again. Now he was blocked off from both levels, so he ran over to the side, and the third shot gained him nothing. It was very likely that the shot was only reaching about halfway, but it certainly afforded him, those who were watching, the laugh of the day. Doug was pretty sure to carry enough shells from that time on. Murray was born and raised in the Haliburton area, and some of his relatives were still living there. One fall, we were having a tougher than usual time selling apples. Murray volunteered to go with me to sell a load in his old home district. He was convinced they were always short of fresh fruit. We loaded the 37 two-ton Ford with 120 bushels and headed out. We canvassed most stores on the way up, and the further we got from home, the cheaper the price became. We stayed at a motel at Minton, and then tried every store in the town of Haliburton the next day, with no success at all. One old guy said the country was appled to death. We sold our first 3 bushels for $1.50, each to a gang of men working for the Ontario Hydro along one of the country roads. They said they were from a camp of about 100 men, which was located some 12 miles back in the bush. The only road was 2 ruts through solid bush that was both crooked and hilly. Our luck, we met a hydro truck coming out and had to back about 100 yards to find a place wide enough to allow the truck to pass. Even then, we were so close that he tore the tarpaulin covering my truck as he passed. When we finally arrived at the camp, we were informed that the cook's supplier had gone out that morning to buy supplies, so we turned around and struggled out the main road. The only thing left, door-to-door peddling. The small towns were well supplied, so we decided on the country roads. Murray took one side and I took the other. With a bushel of apples on our shoulder, we walked up each of those long country lanes, knocked on the door, and hoped we would not have to haul it back to the truck. It became quite a competition and a laugh a minute. I got 148 pennies for one bushel I sold. Alway Watt was a farmer who sold us most of the hay for our horses and cow for a number of years. He lived near Tapleytown, and we hauled it loose on the old Model A and later on the 37. We got the hay directly from the field as quickly as it was cut, cured, and raked in windrows. Alway loaded the old truck until you could hardly see the wheels. Sometimes I helped him and Lib drove the truck. The old-fashioned hay loader was towed by the truck as you drove up and down the field straddling the windrows. When Alway was satisfied he had a load, it was 10 feet wide, 12 feet high, and about 20 feet long. At least 6 feet behind the rear wheels and out over the cab to the front of the radiator. It was usually necessary to cut or pull enough hay away from the windshield to allow vision at least straight ahead. The reason I can remember the dimensions of the load is because I always had such a time getting through the 12 feet by 12 feet high doors on the barn. The hay brushed both sides and top unless you hit it dead center, and you could lose some before getting inside. Once inside, you pitched the hay, one forkful at a time, into the mow, leveled it off, and went back for another load. Alway Watt was an expert loader because he never lost even a small part of any load. Coming down the mountain was a real hazard because of the railway halfway down. The road crossed the tracks at a 45-degree angle, and consequently the view to the left was completely blocked with only limited vision to the right. I doubt if I would have the nerve to tackle the same job under similar circumstances today. Later in the summer, we hauled all the buckwheat straw to spread on the ground. This had been chopped into short lengths, so it was hauled inside the racks of the truck. Alway usually burned the stacks, so there was no charge, just a heck of a lot of hard work. Jimmy Corman and I were invited by Lauren Lee to go on our first deer hunt in the fall of 1939. Ira Lee, Alan Lee, Almer Wilson, Dr. Alex Barnaby, and Lauren made a total of 7. We went up number 11 highway to Pawson, turned left at the Restool, and from there we walked about 3 miles to Stormy Lake while our supplies and equipment were hauled by a team of horses pulling what they had called a jumper. It was well named because they jumped creeks, logs, and holes all the way in. There were a number of good-sized valleys to cross, and that team, having worked in the bush for a number of years, knew exactly how to handle the situation. The jumper was a homemade outfit and built somewhat similar to the front half of the bobsleigh. The road was not even a good trail and wandered wherever seemed to be the easiest way to get through. Some of the hills were almost straight down for a distance of about 60 yards, level for 10, and then up at the same angle. Without any commands, the horses would start down the hill on all 4 feet and the first 10 yards, and then as soon as Jumper pushed harder, they would sit on the rumps and slide to the bottom. The minute they hit the level at the bottom, they were on their feet and scrambling for all they were worth to climb the hill in front of them. We made it there without trouble, but on the return trip at the end of the hunt, the jumper fell apart. The deer we had were on the bottom of the load, and the weight of our equipment wore all the hair and hide off the side touching the ground. Jim and I were really anxious to do our share of the work, so we volunteered for any job. Jim got the wood cutting detail, and I had the water to haul. The cabin, such it was located about 30 yards from the lakeshore and about 20 feet above water level. I never hauled so much water even when we had ducks. We had 4 pails, and it seemed that 2 were always empty, no matter how hard I tried to keep them full. I found out the next year the guys had dumped about 3/4 of what I had hauled out the back window. We did our hunting by what we called drives. 5 of us would take watches, while the remaining 2 would walk towards them, making all the noise they could. We could make about 3 or 4 drives a day. On about the last day of the hunt, I was given the first watch, about 150 yards from camp. The others were placed along both the rims of the same valley, and the drivers took another route to get to the far end, which was about half a mile from the watch. The bush had been logged out several years before, and the new growth, mostly hardwoods, grew in profusion a foot to 10 feet tall. Vision was limited by the large 1 to 2 foot diameter trees left for the next log harvest and a few stumps and mounds. I figured there was just no way any deer could be run out of the valley without me at least seeing him go. An hour had passed before I heard the first barking and yelling out from the drivers, and tension grew as they came closer and closer. When it seemed our men should break into view at any moment, there, not 25 yards in front of me, from out of nowhere, was a deer at full speed running towards me. It looked as big as a horse and made enough noise for 2. The old 38-55 Winchester was at my shoulder and firing before I had a chance to aim. The deer made a quick left turn and went even faster down the trail leading to camp. I fired 2 more shots before the deer disappeared from my view. Evidently, that deer had been hiding in what I thought was wide open territory from the time I first took my watch. We had been instructed to remain on our stations until the drivers came through, or we were certain the drive was over, so it was difficult to contain my excitement until they finally came to me, which was actually only a matter of minutes. I was rather sure I had missed completely, but the veterans in the group convinced me it was worth a good look. Sure enough, my first deer piled up in a heap not 50 yards from the back door of our camp. I had no luck at all trying to convince those guys that it was a result of good planning. For me, there was over 30 hunt trips to follow this one. Each one had different problems, different weather, different experiences, sometimes different locations and companions, but always each trip was filled with rich and warm experiences and good fellowship. At the risk of becoming boring, I would like to explain more fully the family relation, especially on Mother's side of the family. Mother was the youngest of 10 children. Levy, the eldest brother, moved to BC at an early age and was elected mayor of Vernon, which office he held for several years between 1920 and 1935. I met him only once, when he visited Ontario in the 1920s. I know nothing of his family, who, I believe, are residents of western U.S. Born in 1860 and died in 1932. Marietta, born in 1862, was the artist in the family. She taught oil painting, and we have many of her paintings. She looked after Mother as a child until her death in 1902. Martha, number 3 on the list, married Sam Arthur and moved to the U.S. She died in 1903. Fourth was Ellen, affectionately known as Aunt Nell, born 1866 and died in 1946. She married her first cousin, George Stewart, and wisely had no children. They lived on the farm directly across No. 8 Highway from Fruitland Post Office until Uncle George's death in 1935. I was the apple of her eye, and the feeling was mutual. She took me to see every Tom Mix movie that ever came to Hamilton, and we rarely missed a circus. No. 5 was Clara, who married Charles Althouse and moved to Handle, Saskatchewan, as homesteaders, raising a large family, and died in 1940. I only saw her once. Sixth, Uncle Tom, born 1871, married Ralphie Campaign. He worked for Bell Telephone as lineman in Ontario for several years, then moved to Algonquin in BC. He had a cattle ranch where he raised 2 children, Margaret and a boy he named Audrey. Margaret stayed in the West, and the rest of the family moved back to Ontario in the mid-20s to a farm in Ancaster. Uncle Tom was generous and warm-hearted, always pleased to greet you at home or away. He was checkered companion of Ontario, but I could beat him consistently at chess. He loved a fair game, but hated to lose. He died in 1942. He liked to go on a booze spree occasionally, and was probably the funniest man you had ever met after the first 2. He topped all the stewards in the art of teasing and probably enjoyed it the most. Margaret May came seventh on the list, being born in 1874. She married William Batters of Galt, and together they raised two boys, Stanley and Frank. Aunt May was the sedate one of the family and enjoyed having everything in its proper place. She always looked well dressed, no matter what the occasion, loved to play cards, whether day or night, and like Uncle Tom, hated to be the loser. Lib played rummy many hours with her while she lived at the farm with us. Stanley was killed in action in the War of 1914 to 1918. My dad got Frank a job as accountant for the Ford dealer, Wentworth Motors in Hamilton. He worked his own way from accountant to secretary of the Ford Motor Corporation of Canada, something like third in command, and was retired from that position. John, born in 1877, lived only 26 years. Stanley, number 9, born 1879, was the ambitious one. He educated himself through correspondence and books to become a land surveyor. He took a job for the Dominion government to survey much of the province of Alberta. He married Mildred Jankowski and moved to Lacombe, then to Red Deer, both in Alberta. He had 2 sons, Reginald and Lloyd, and 1 daughter, Evelyn. The family moved to Burlington, Ontario in the early 1920s. Uncle Stan was a shrewd investor and accumulated a comfortable capital to invest in stocks. The Depression cleaned him out, and he bought half of Uncle George's farm at Fruitland. He bought the other half from Aunt Nell after Uncle George's death in the early 1930s. Aunt Mildred died in the early 30s, and Uncle Stan married Jessie Bryce, a widow of 2 children, Bill and Helen. They all moved into the big house of Aunt Nell's, and although Uncle Stan had promised her a lifetime residency, they treated her so poorly that she was forced to move out within 2 years. This is when she came to our place. This shook both Mother and Aunt Nell's faith in humanity rather seriously, but being good living people themselves, they would not allow this to shatter the family ties. I have heard Mother say that Aunt Nell prayed frequently that God might forgive him for his mistake. Uncle Stan enjoyed sports of all kinds and was really good at tennis and badminton until his heart disqualified him. He liked checkers and chess, and most excessively cold winter days would find him at our place playing chess with one of us. He put up a good game, but was never disheartened if he lost, but would simply try harder the next game. If I could capture his queen early in the game, he would say, "Well, I didn't see that," forfeit the game, and be happy to start another. He was a shrewd businessman and seldom came out low man on any deal, even if he had to resort to tricky maneuvers. Reg was a little wild, married Sadie early in his life, refused a formal education, but trained himself to become an engineer for the Ontario Northland Railway, working out of North Bay, Ontario, and raised a large family and died about 1966. Lloyd was my favorite, and although he was 4 years older, we got along just great and enjoyed many things together. He married Merle Heatley and raised 2 sons, John and Kent. More about them later. He became an engineer and worked for the CNR and later for a mining company in Marmora, Ontario. Just as he was really happy with his job, he got cancer of the spine and died within the year, suffering untold agonies. Evelyn was really clever and received a good formal education, traveled the world, and later married Arnold Smith, who is now Secretary General of the British Commonwealth. He also held the position of ambassador for Canada in Russia and Egypt. Last, but far from least, my mother, born in 1882 and named Georgina Albadine Stewart. Here was a woman who possessed all the finer qualities of a saint and a disposition to match. She had a great respect for honesty, integrity, and fair play. Her aim in life was seldom selfish. In fact, her personal wants usually took second place to those of her family and friends. She was a proud person, but never a snob. There is very little difference in the greeting at the door to the mayor of the town or the beggar asking for a handout, if both were strangers. She enjoyed music and had a very nice alto voice, but was always too shy and nervous to perform in public, exactly opposite to Aunt Nell, who could shake the rafters in the church if the crowd was big enough to please her. She supported the Wesley United Church with all she could afford, serving as president of the Women's Auxiliary for several years. In spite of rather poor health in later years, if a crisis came up or a need for her help, she seemed to have the ability and stamina to raise the occasion and do whatever was required of her, regardless of the consequences. There are many who will agree that to know her was to love her. In spite of being very straight-laced, she had a jovial nature and was slow to anger, loved a good joke, made friends easily, especially with young children, and loved to tease, like all the Stuarts. End of chapter 6.